Good morning. Now, Mr. Connell, we have as our first witness, Ms. Haynes.
Yes, Lord.
Good morning, Ms. Haynes.
Good morning.
Now, as you know, you're about to be asked some questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting here. But first, I understand that you're prepared to make an affirmation.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Ms. Haynes. Now, we've scheduled the morning for your evidence. Whether it takes the whole morning, we shall see. It may not. If we find ourselves at 11:30, we'll probably take a coffee break about that time. But if at any time you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we'll break for whatever reason. But I'll now hand over to Mr. Connell.
Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning, Ms. Haynes.
Good morning.
You are currently employed at the Golden Jubilee Hospital.
That's right.
It's now an NHS facility, is that?
It is an NHS facility, yes.
Is that a national NHS facility rather than run by a particular board?
It is. It's rather than a territorial board, for example, GGC, it's called a special board, so it's the National Waiting Times Hospital for Scotland.
Oh, it's an interesting title. Is that because it's trying to reduce waiting times?
It's trying to help the territorial boards with their waiting times by offering additional capacity for patients.
Now, when you were at GGC, you held a number of positions. Most recently, you were board complaints manager, which you say in your witness statement, and if we can bring the witness statement up on screen, we'll use that to help us understand roughly where we've got to in the process. If we go to, it'll be on page 522. That's the first page of your witness statement. You say it then transitioned into corporate services manager. Just explain to us what that means.
So when I first took up post, that particular role, I was the board complaints manager. And in early 2018, my boss retired, and there was a gap between him leaving and his successor starting. And the tasks were split up between myself and a colleague. The main task that I took on was for whistleblowing, but therefore there was some others as well. It therefore, I suppose, became more obvious that it wasn't just complaints that was within my remit. So therefore, the title of board complaint manager was no longer, I suppose, appropriate, and that's why the title corporate services manager was given, just to recognise the breadth of the role.
Thank you. Now, if we go to the next page, we start to see you describe your role. Would I be right in assuming that an organisation like GGC, once you enter a complaint process, there are then set steps which have to be followed before that complaint is completed? Is that so? Just roughly, what are we talking about? What happens?
So when a board will receive a complaint, there's a national complaints handling procedure that needs to be followed. And there's two stages to that, a step 1 or a step 2. Step 1 is a kind of informal resolution. You can phone the patient or the complainant and try to resolve, and that should be done within 5 working days. And then there's a stage 2 of the process, which means a more formal investigation. The patient or person complaining will receive a written response or should be within 20 working days. And thereafter, if they remain unhappy, they've got the option of going to the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman.
I see. So in the more formal process, it's largely a paper communication that's received by the complainant.
Yes.
Thank you. In paragraph 8, you touch on the duty of candour legislation, and you quite properly point out this was not part of your direct responsibility.
Yeah.
Can you help us at all as to who drew up the NHS GGC duty of candour policy?
I believe it was the clinical governance department. I don't know which individual, but it would have sat within their remit.
Thank you. And another thing that you dealt with, and I think this will be after that initial period, presumably, was whistleblowing.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And am I right in understanding that your primary job was to support the process, to make sure all the steps that needed done were done?
Yes, that's correct.
And you set out on page 524, which is the next page of your witness statement, the different stages, local investigation, more formal investigation, with someone from a different service, and then a non-executive board member. Now, is that the NHS GGC policy, or is that the national policy that you had?
This was the local GGC policy, so before the national policy came out. So, and I say policy, but actually it was a policy within a policy, because it was a section within the board's code of conduct paper.
Right. And you point out that there was a national approach which appeared in 2021. Did that differ significantly from what you had?
Yes, a fair bit actually. So that was when I started in post, or when I started being involved with whistleblowing in early 2018, the work was already well underway to prepare for the national guidance that was going to come out. It was due to come out in 2020, but as a result of COVID, it was delayed until 2021. The national whistleblowing policy actually very closely is very similar to the National Complaints Handling Procedure. It came from the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, who holds a dual role, and when these standards, the whistleblowing standards, were published, she took on the role of National Whistleblowing Officer too.
In outline, the NHS GGC policy that you put in your statement looks relatively simple. What are the major differences under the national one? The
national one is much more thorough and robust, and I think gives much more structure to how whistleblowing should be handled. And I think it was a welcome introduction, so that there was consistency across all of NHS Scotland.
And you say it's more thorough. What do you mean by that?
I suppose in reflecting on the GGC policy at that time, the stage one, and you may ask me about this, a local investigation undertaken by a line manager. I'm not sure in GGC how much that happened, and certainly how much corporately we were aware of it happening, because, you know, if we go by this policy, it was a local investigation undertaken by a line manager. Corporately, we wouldn't know about that, and therefore have no means to record it. So therefore, I'm not sure how many stage ones there actually would have been. Whereas when the new policy came out, the national policy, there was much more structure in the recording and how we should record, etc. So I think the governance around about it allowed us to be a lot more robust with that governance.
Yeah. So if I understand that answer, it's possible that under the local policy, somebody could carry out an investigation, but because there was nothing which, I can put it this way, labelled it whistleblowing investigation stage one, you and anyone else involved in whistleblowing wouldn't know it was happening at all.
Exactly.
You say sorry, Just remind me, when did you first get involved in whistleblowing?
Early 2018.
Did you see an increase in whistleblowing during your time at the board?
Yes.
Minor, large? What? How would you reflect on it?
I don't think a worrying increase year on year between 2018 and when I left in 2022. There were more whistleblowings. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think hopefully people felt that they had the voice to be able to take forward whistleblowing concerns if they wished to do so. There was publicity that went along with the introduction of the national standard, so people had an awareness on how to whistleblow. So I don't have exact numbers, and the numbers were relatively low as well if we think about the size of the organisation. I can certainly after this confirm the numbers if that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's enough for you to tell me that you saw an increase. You went on to make a slightly different point, which is that wearing your hat, you didn't see an increase in whistleblowing as a problem. Is that right?
No, I think the numbers weren't worryingly rising. They were rising, but I think that is part of, like I say, the publicity that went along with the introduction of the national standards.
Reflecting on your time dealing with whistleblowing, did you think the process was an effective one in achieving any particular objects?
Yes, I do.
And one of the issues that's been raised, not only in this inquiry, but in several other inquiries into different topics elsewhere, is the attitude of other staff to people who whistleblow. Can you help us at all about what you gathered or picked up about the attitudes of to those who whistleblow?
I suppose it's very different depending on the circumstances, and there was a wide range of whistleblowing. From my perspective, a huge amount of effort went into managing that process really closely and sensitively, and treating concerns in a confidential, supportive and kind manner.
Yeah, I can understand that bit, but for instance, we've had some evidence in circumstances where it's not always possible for everybody to remain anonymous in a true sense, because some people will know that A, B or C is whistleblowing. We've had some evidence indicating that colleagues thought whistleblowing was unprofessional or sort of not the right thing to do. Have you any input you can offer on that?
Do you mean that colleagues would think that people that raised whistleblowing concerns were unprofessional?
Yes.
That's not something I'd heard before, and I wouldn't consider that unprofessional. In fact, the opposite. The huge majority of people that whistleblow do so for the right reasons. They've got a concern, and especially in the NHS when we're dealing with patients and patient safety, etc. So I would say that it's the opposite of being unprofessional, and if people have got legitimate concerns and they feel that they're not being listened to, then the whistleblowing process is in place for that very reason.
Yes.
I wonder if I could just ask you to repeat that. I fully understood the answer, but quite frankly, I think it's worth writing down word for word.
Oh, no, okay.
So you asked the question whether some people might consider whistleblowing unprofessional.
Yes.
Sort of. Well, we'll just leave it at the word unprofessional. And you began your answer by saying you would not regard it as unprofessional. Could I just ask you to, as it were, give me your answer at dictation speed?
Okay. So I would consider it to be the opposite of being unprofessional. And the reason for that is that in its truest form, whistleblowing is there to allow people the mechanism to express concerns. And that's particularly important, I think, in a healthcare setting where those concerns might relate to patient safety. And if they have tried to raise concerns through normal line management structure and don't feel like they're getting anywhere, then that is why the whistleblowing process exists. And it is to ensure that there is safety and that there is learning. So I consider it to be the opposite of unprofessional.
Thank you.
If we can move on to the next page of your witness statement, 525, where you mention Dr. Redding, and we know it was Dr. Redding because Dr. Redding has told us it was Dr. Redding. She raised a whistleblowing concern and then a further one later on. And you say you had some contact with Dr. Peters, but you can't really recall what that was. And then there was a quite different anonymous whistleblowing concern mentioned, I think, in paragraph 17 of your witness statement. Just wanted to ask you about the stage 2 of Dr. Redding's. Who picks who does the whistleblowing job?
So just to give some context here, I remember this whistleblowing because it's the first ever whistleblowing I ever did in that role. And I think as time went on, practice changed, but at that time I didn't have established practice or rhythm or anything because, like I say, this was my very first whistleblowing. In the whistleblowing policy at that time, the named directors who investigate whistleblowing at stage 2 level are named with their contact details, and usually a whistleblower would write to one of those directors. So that's what happened in Dr. Redding's case. She wrote to Linda de Casteker, and Linda de Casteker investigated the whistleblowing. As time went on, and with the introduction of the new standards, and as I became more practiced and experienced in whistleblowing, we changed that process. We widened the pool of investigators, it's still at director level, but there was a much wider pool, and I set up a generic email address for whistleblowers. So I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like whistleblowing@ggc.scot.nhs.uk, and I held that email address so I could look at any new whistleblowing cases that came in and assign them to one of the directors. And to do so, I would consider things like, are they impartial? So if a whistleblowing came in and maybe one of those directors had an operational responsibility for that service area, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to give that whistleblowing concern to that director, because you want to try as much as possible ensure impartiality. I would consider how many other whistleblowing cases they may have ongoing at the moment, to divvy up workload appropriately, that kind of thing. But at the time of Dr. Redding's whistleblow, as I say, it was my first ever one. She wrote to Linda de Casteker, and Linda de Casteker took it forward.
The reason I was going to ask that is that we've had other evidence about other parts of the process that the inquiry is considering, which Dr. de Casteker actually played an active role in IMTs and so on. And I wanted to ask you why particularly her, but I think you've explained that to me, so thank you for that. I think in paragraph 19, you give a slightly more general evidence about what you saw your role to do. The bit that I just wondered about, and it may be simply because of the way it's written rather than, or my failure to understand it, that you say, well, you have to ensure concerns were investigated. Your role includes supporting whistleblowers, witnesses, and investigating directors. And I'm trying to think, how do you balance that? You're trying to support the whistleblower, so they're the person that's made the whistleblow, and at the same time, you're trying to support the person that's investigating them. And that rather sounds a different job. I just wonder how you managed to square these two.
I suppose I didn't see it like that. I didn't see it as different roles. I saw it as an all-encompassing role. So if I think about how I would support the whistleblowers, again, as time went on, maybe not right to start with, but as time went on, I would be the point of contact for whistleblowers to come into the organisation. I would talk them through how the process would work. I'd speak to them, support them, give them updates on where we were. And then with the directors, I would do things like, you know, if they were trying to source documents as evidence as part of the case, I would do that. I would collate notes, that evidence to help draft the final reports, that type of thing. So I didn't see those two things as at odds. I saw it as all part of the whistleblowing process.
Thank you. Well, I was going to ask you about that, so I'll ask you about it just now. At a couple of points in your statement, you talk about drafting reports or writing reports, in fact. And the immediate question is, well, is that not for the decision taker to write the report, not for you? But maybe you could just help us understand what your role was.
So I suppose, again, if I think about when I took on whistleblowing, I was applying a lot of my area of expertise, which was with complaints handling, and there was a lot of similarities because they, you know, both processes involve an investigation and a written outcome. So for complaints handling, what would happen is something very similar. You would collate information, you would maybe collect statements from the doctors or nurses involved, you would look at evidence from case notes, you would prepare a draft response that would go through checks with the people that needed to do so for factual accuracy and ultimately be signed off, for example, by a director. So I was applying that knowledge and skill set to whistleblowing and doing something very similar.
Yeah. And can I just sort of come back to the question again? Because people might think, you know, if Linda de Kesticker is the whistleblowing decision maker, she's drafting a report and issuing her report, not you. So can you explain your role in actually compiling that final document?
Yeah, so as I've said, I would take the notes, for example, if people were interviewed or any evidence, I would compile the response, but ultimately, if Linda de Kesticker was the director responsible, I would send her the draft report and she would review it and only put her name to it if she was happy with it. She might ask for some changes, amendments, but ultimately it was her name on it, so she had to be content with it. And that was, like I say, through complaints, that was a very normal practice for somebody else to perhaps write or do the first draft of a report or a letter, but the person whose name on it was ultimately responsible, so they should make sure that they are reading it thoroughly and are content with the content before signing it.
Did you find you got a lot of revisals to your drafts?
Not hugely.
You were asked on page 526, which is paragraph 21, you were asked about something I think that happened in 2017, but you've explained that that was before your involvement in whistleblowing, so you're not able to comment on that. And then you were referred to Dr. Redding's stage 1 whistleblow, but then again, that was prior to your involvement.
Yes.
I just have but you were involved in the stage 3 whistleblow. I just have a point of detail I wanted to ask you about it. One phrase that cropped up in the exchanges at that time was that it was said that Dr. Peters didn't accept that infection control was a nurse-led operation, and Sandra Devine, who was the lead nurse, was asked, well, is that what you said? And she said, no, I didn't say that because it couldn't be a nurse-led operation. Of course it couldn't. Are you familiar with that phrase or where it comes from? This
No.
complaint about nurse-led operation?
No.
Thank you. And you actually been asked about the stage 3 case, but essentially you say, well, the report is there, but otherwise you don't have any other recollection of that particular exercise. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that between the time of writing this statement and now, because as you know, I don't work for GGC anymore. So at the time of writing this statement, I didn't have access to my old files, etc. However, in preparation for coming to today, GGC did give me access to my old files. So I have been able to refamiliarise myself, and I do recall more of it now, but I don't think there's anything that different to what I've described in my statement, and I'm aware of whether it was a stage 1 or not, and the stage 3 report does go into detail around about that.
Yes, and I think you right. So you've refreshed your memory on your files, but you don't really want to change anything in your witness statement, having read the files. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I would agree with the conclusions in the stage 3 report. If that's what I suppose if you're asking me around about that stage 1 whistleblower and whether it should have been recorded as a stage 1 or not. And I think in that stage 3 whistleblower, it's described that actually, although no reference specifically was made to describe that as a stage 1 whistleblower, at some point there was an email that made reference to escalating to stage 2, and therefore the inference was that it was intended by Dr. Redding that the initial concerns were a stage 1.
Yeah. And the way you put that in paragraph 25 of your witness statement on page 527 is that with the benefit of hindsight, you think it should have been treated as a stage 1 whistleblowing if that was the intention, but you don't think anyone had any ill intent in not doing that.
Yes, and again, for preparing for today, I did find a letter from the chairman that was sent to Dr. Redding that described that retrospectively it would be put into the formal report that went to formal committees of the board, saying that it wasn't reported at the time, but it was being done so retrospectively.
Right, now I want to turn to a slightly different topic, which is around communications, in particular communications with patients and families, which I think you're aware has been a topic of some debate at this inquiry already. One of the issues that was raised just the other day was that Professor White thought he was to be the point of contact for the families. That was the whole point of him being appointed and so on.
Yeah.
And then the next thing he heard was, Jennifer Haynes is to be the point of contact for the families. How did that happen? Because he thought that was a bit confusing at times.
Yes, I watched Professor White's evidence. It's not an issue that I was aware that was a concern. He was a point of contact for the families, but there still, I suppose, needed to be a central point within the health board to coordinate information and do the types of tasks that were assigned to me. So I've described in my statement, I can't pinpoint an exact time where it came about. Nobody said, okay, Jen, you're the point of contact for families and that's it. Now, it's just something that emerged organically. I think because of that I was working in the board headquarters, I had a skill set with complaints and whistleblowing. There was similarities to that process. And I was drafted in to help with that, and then it became this kind of contact point.
I wanted to ask you one thing about that. There's been some evidence from families, quite a number of families over the course of the inquiry that what they were tending to do was looking for answers to questions. Quite a lot of them wanted to meet people, they wanted things answered, they were asking about things, they wanted to know the answers to these questions. And there's a debate about how that was handled. And you've already heard Professor White's evidence on that. And one of the points that's cropped up is where this question of make a complaint comes into that picture, because I wanted to ask you about it, because you, I think, are the person that's been identified as having had these communications. So I can come to that. I think the suggestion is that if you're somebody who wants answers, you want to know things, you don't know what happened, you're trying to find out. And I'm paraphrasing what's been said. If somebody comes along and says, I'm here to help you make a complaint, that's not necessarily a welcome intervention. Do you see the point I'm getting at?
Yes.
I wonder if you can help us as to how this happened.
So, when again, in preparation for today, when I was looking at contact with families, actually the majority of the correspondence with families were not treated via the formal complaint process. We applied a similar approach, just in terms of, receiving a letter, identifying the main points or questions, going out to various colleagues who held the answer to those questions and preparing a draft response that was then checked and signed and sent to the families. But most of those were not within the formal complaints handling process. The ones that were, it was because the families were expressing a level of dissatisfaction or explicitly saying that they wanted to complain, in which case then I would explain this is what the complaints process is. That was absolutely not to shut down or anything, but if they were expressing that, then I felt that I had a responsibility to explain what the process was, and help them navigate that process.
I mean, I can see if somebody says, I want to complain, Mr. X shouted at me, or whatever the point is, you are the appropriate person to say, fine, I'll explain the system. This is how you go about it. This is what will then happen. But I think there were at least some indications from families that they felt it was being used as a method to stop them getting information and force them into a sort of written process. Any comments on that?
Yes, again, it's the absolute opposite of that. I or the health board would never want to force somebody into a process and absolutely not shut them down. Again, when reviewing my correspondence with families, there was offers of meetings with every correspondence that went out. It would never be the case that if a family wrote to us and we replied, that was it. We wouldn't reply again because we'd done their complaint and send them to the Ombudsman. We were very much, and I was very much trying to, ensure that I was being supported. And if they had more questions, that we were answering those. And it was absolutely not the case that I or the health board were ever trying to shut down families. And I'm really, really sorry to hear that that was the perception, because I personally would never, ever have wanted to do that.
I think the challenge that you face in producing that answer, I suspect, is that most complaints have a process.
Yeah.
People have leaflets about the complaints process and so on, which explains what happens.
Yeah.
And usually what happens is what you explained to us earlier. In other words, you set out what your complaint is, it goes off, is investigated, and then in due course you get a written answer, which doesn't, on the face of this system, allow for meetings, requests for information and so on to be part of that process. You see the point I'm making?
Yeah, I can, but I do think that meetings were regularly offered pre and post letters going out. And I'm aware that I'm aware of one family, maybe there's more, that were criticised that I couldn't just answer their questions, but I had to put some sort of process around it, whether it was the complaints process or something similar, because I wasn't a subject matter expert on any of the issues that were being raised, whether it be water, ventilation, clinical care. I had to go to whoever was the expert in that area, get the information from them and put it through some sort of process to make sure that anything that I was saying to families was factually accurate. And I didn't feel I could do so without putting some sort of rigour around that.
That rather sounds as if you turn it into a complaint when they don't want to complain, is it not?
I don't think so, because I didn't, like I say, most correspondence with families as part of this didn't go through the complaints handling procedure. And they weren't recorded as complaints.
You say in paragraph 28 on page 528 that for everyone who wanted a written response, it was part of your job to make sure that they got one, and it was then signed off by a senior colleague. I can understand if you've got somebody's demanding answers about ventilation or something, and so you go to somebody who knows about ventilation, you get the answers, and you're then in a position to feed that back. Why does it go to the chief executive?
Because all letters that went out to families were signed off by someone of much more senior level to me, and I've described there, it was the chief executive, the chief operating officer, or the deputy medical director.
And you say this kind of post that you had, well, I'll even call it a post, it just sort of happened, rather than somebody said, I am hereby appointing you as family communications person, is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
Which may explain why Professor White thought it was a bit confusing, because nothing formal had been done. Is that possible?
It's possible. Like I say, until yesterday, I didn't realise that that had been a concern.
The other point, I suppose, is perhaps quite a challenging one for somebody like yourself, who's not a medical or ventilation or expert in all these technical matters. You say in paragraph 30 of your statement that there was no job description or written expectations of what I would cover, but you very much saw your role as supporting patients and advocating for them. Is that right? Is that what you felt you were doing?
Absolutely, yes.
So you weren't advocating for the board?
I saw my role as I said there, as advocating for the families, as well as being an employee for GGC. I'm just a human being, and I had so much empathy for these families and what they were going through. Some of the things that they described in correspondence, etc., when I would go out to various colleagues for the information I needed to pull together a response to them, a lot of it was quite technical or clinical, and I don't have a clinical or technical background. If the information I was getting back wasn't clear, I would go back and say, nope, you've not explained that clearly. I need more information. We need to answer the question that the families have given us. So I saw my role, as I've described there, as very much supporting and advocating for the patients and families.
No, I think you having listened to Professor White's evidence, you'll have heard there was quite a lot of criticism of the communications to the families, much of which was then accepted by the Oversight Board in one of its reports. Do you accept that that criticism was fair?
I think it's difficult, because when we were writing letters to the families, I tried really hard to make sure that any information that was in there was clear, concise, but also empathetic and compassionate. It would be arrogant of me to assume that it was perfect all the time. And Craig yesterday in his evidence said that we needed to listen to families as the experts. So absolutely, yeah, they have criticised, and that's their perception, and that's how they feel. And I'm deeply, deeply sorry that was the perception, because it certainly wasn't the intent.
I mean, you say in paragraph 33, and this was a point I think that was picked up by Professor White in his evidence yesterday, that you were acutely aware of the pressure that was being put on NHS GGC senior leadership by the Scottish Government, and you wondered whether that was conducive to things getting done. I suppose the other point, the other side of that coin that might be put to you is that was necessary to improve things. Do you have any view on that?
Yes. Whenever I was reflecting on Professor White's evidence yesterday, and I'm glad I've had the opportunity to speak about this, because that comment in my statement was absolutely not a reflection on him as an individual, but of the situation, because it was highly pressurised. At that time, the board had been put on stage 4 of special measures. That's why Professor White was there. There was media stories constantly. There was internal investigation, an external review, a case note review, and also at some point there was the confirmation of this public inquiry. So there was a huge amount of pressure within that building, and I think anybody within that building, which were the board headquarters, couldn't not be aware of that.
In fact, you say in paragraph 34 that from your own personal perspective, you found this a tough part of your career.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. As I've said before, I'm just a person, and what these families were going through was awful. And and also, in describing this, I don't want it to sound like there was absolute basis for these concerns. There were issues with that hospital, and that must have been extremely worrying for I can't even begin to imagine how worrying that was for the families.
And in paragraph 35, you're asked the kind of general question, which I think we touched on in a way already, which is that you're aware that a number of families and patients were just not happy with the way communications were being done. You would be aware of that.
Yes.
And you say there your view was that there was a perception of the board not being open and honest.
Yeah.
And covering up. People were wary of board people. Does that include you?
Yes.
I think in fairness, even Professor White said at points people were wondering whether they could trust him.
Yes.
Did you have much dealings with Professor White during this period?
Yes, a lot. Yep.
Did you think the working process with him worked well or not?
Yes, I did. We had a pleasant, I felt we had a pleasant working relationship. He would get correspondence from families in, he would send it to me. I would then go and do the investigation that I've described. At the stage that Professor White was there, he would be part of the people that would review the final letter that went out before it was signed and sent to the families. So, yeah.
You deal in paragraph 36 with one of the points again, which we've touched on with others, that one of the challenges was that sometimes it took a while to get communication out.
Yes.
And that didn't always make the families very happy.
Yes.
You recognise that as an issue that arose.
Absolutely, yes.
In fact, you instance at the foot of that page in paragraph 38, an instance where somebody you knew said, "I'm not taking my child there," and that bothered you, did it?
Yeah, very much.
In paragraph 39, I think you suggest that the true position may be that some things could have been done differently or perhaps better, but people were doing their best. Is that the position you want to tell us? That's your evidence.
Yes, that's my view. And again, Professor White touched on it yesterday about the feedback that we were getting or that has come out from the families. So absolutely, I'm sure things could have been done better. In my view, there was just a complete breakdown of trust, and that was really very difficult to try and regain.
Well, let me ask you about something that I asked Professor White about because it cropped up from an unexpected source. Dr. Mathers was being asked about communications and whether they were effective, and basically said, well, don't ask me or the person who drafts them, ask the person who's getting them whether they're effective, because you have to keep constantly putting yourself in the shoes of the recipient. Do you think that's a fair point to make?
An absolutely fair point to make. So I could show you hundreds of emails that I had with families where I felt that I was being very kind and empathetic and supportive and getting the answers, etc. And the responses that I got back would suggest that they were appreciative of that, etc. But it is all about perception, and I am acutely aware that in many cases there's a poor perception, and it would be arrogant to not listen and try to learn from that.
The only other point you were asked about was a point that cropped up yesterday where there was a series of, I think Professor White called them the 71 questions.
Yes.
And you, I take it, weren't the drafter of all the technical information that went into that, but you helped put it together. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I did do quite a lot of the drafting, but heavily based on the information that I was getting from a huge range of experts and senior colleagues.
Thank you. I have nothing further for this witness, my lord.
Ms. Haynes, a little earlier than we perhaps anticipated. However, what I need to do is check with the room to see if there's any further questions there. So we'll rise 5 or 10 minutes. I'll be able to tell you whether that's the end of your evidence or there may be 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay.
So if I can ask you to return to the witness room. Mr. Connell?
There were no further questions, my Lord.
I understand there's no more further questions, Ms. Haynes, which means you're free to go. But before you do, thank you for your attendance this morning, and thank you for your written statement, which of course is part of your evidence, the inquiry. I'm very grateful for both, but as I say, you're free to go.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now, Mr. Connell, we have Professor Wallace. What's your information on the timing on that?
My information earlier in the day, my Lord, was that she had been asked to be available to give evidence from 12, but had indicated a likely intention to be here around 11:30. I haven't heard any update on that, but it's easily checked. So perhaps it might be appropriate to take a short break just now and anticipate we might be resuming somewhere around 11:30.
Right. We'll do that. I'd ask legal representatives not to go too far. Whether coffee will be immediately available, I'm not sure, but I'm sure efforts will be made in that direction. So we'll see if we can begin about 11:30, but obviously we would want to give Professor Wallace a moment to draw breath before beginning. So if legal representatives just keep in touch with the inquiry staff.
Apologies for the slight delay, my lord.
Now, Professor Wallace.
Professor Wallace, indeed.
Good morning, Professor Wallace, and thank you for bringing forward your attendance. That's very helpful. Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite you. First of all, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Absolutely.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallace. Now, I anticipate that your evidence will go into the afternoon, perhaps maybe as, well, we'll just see how long it takes. We'll take a break for lunch at 1, but if at any other time in your evidence you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we'll take a break. Now, Mr. Connell.
Obliged, my lord. Good morning. Yes, it's still good morning. Good morning, Professor Wallace. And as his lordship has said, thank you for moving forward your appearance. That's of great assistance to the inquiry. I start by asking you the same question I ask all the witnesses, which is, you have produced a witness statement. Are you content to adopt that as your evidence?
Absolutely.
And you understand that that then means that the whole of the witness statement and everything referred to it becomes part of your evidence, even if we don't deal with it today.
Understood.
Now, your original profession is as a nurse. Is that right?
I am.
And you set out the journey that you've had wearing that original title in your CV. And you very fairly say on the first page of your statement, and what we'll do is we'll use the witness statement as a sort of guide to where we've got to and what topics we're covering. So if we could bring up the witness statement, that would be helpful. We're at page 431. Bundle. You'll see we have electronic page numbers. I'll probably also refer to paragraph numbers, which will probably help you in following where we've got to. You say there in answer to question 2 that you don't have any specialist qualifications in infection prevention and control. Does that pose challenges when you're having to manage people who have a lifetime's experience in IPC?
I think across NHS Scotland, mainly the nurse directors have the lead for infection prevention and control as an executive lead. So I guess it represents a lifelong nursing career where infection control is at the heart of things that we do. You will see from my CV that as an executive director, we have a range of executive lead roles, and infection control is one of them. For example, I'd also have the lead for healthcare scientists. I've got the lead for quality within Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So what we have is a broad knowledge, and then you use your leadership experience, your challenge and your support to drive forward an agenda. So I don't think that managing infection control colleagues, they're pretty feisty. They're really passionate, but all colleagues are. So what you add to that is an executive leadership role to that, and you accept the accountability and responsibility for those areas in your portfolio. And I feel my accountability and responsibility pretty strongly.
You're somebody who had no original involvement with, if I can call it that, with the new Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and then you were, I'll use that, I think I used the phrase with someone else the other day, parachuted in, as it were, to a position, and you explain that on page 433 in the answer to question 6 on this document. I'm just wondering how you dealt with being pulled in 2 different directions, because what you say in the middle of the answer to question 6 is that you were asked to take this post in support of Professor Bade and the Scottish Government oversight arrangements, which is sort of one hat. But we know from elsewhere in your statement that you were reporting to the Chief Executive of the board, who on one view was right at the heart of a lot of the issues that the board was facing. Did that not cause you to be pulled in 2 different directions?
I think the role was extremely challenging. I said further in my statement that I hadn't any knowledge of the detail of what the system was facing. And therefore, I think having that ability to come in fresh, I think added strength to what I was trying to do. I didn't know any of the colleagues involved in infection control and microbiology, and therefore I felt that I would be able to come in and stay in that operational sense of a role. As I've said in my statement, the CNO, Fiona McQueen, had already had Professor Bain there, and therefore she was having that executive lead role, and therefore I would be supporting at that operational level. And I felt with my director experience that I would be able to come in and listen carefully to all colleagues and therefore take that forward. The reporting arrangements, I can see why you would ask that question in terms of how long was I able to keep my independence. But I guess for the corollary of that would be if I had access to the chief executive, I could quite easily be trying to work and listen to my colleagues and take things forward, but be quite disconnected from the organisation. So what I tried to do was retain that independence as long as I could, really focus on working with my microbiology colleagues and infection control colleagues. But I was also really keen to make sure that infection prevention control had a priority within the organisation. The one thing I would say that, I have been really, really experienced, so I'm used to working at that level. So it was quite difficult for me to be in the operational space when I was so used to being in a very strategic space. I think I used that strategic experience to give me the levers to make sure that the work that I wanted to do with the microbiologists and the infection control team, that I could do that, and it could also be central in the organisation. So I think it was difficult. I think I had to be incredibly thoughtful about how I maintained that independence and supported colleagues, but I also needed to make sure that I had the ability to, if there was anything that I needed, either to, go to the chief nursing officer and go directly to the chief executive. So, and that was the path that I absolutely tread for this role.
Did you say to, I'm not sure whether it was Theresa Inkster or Christine Peters at one point, that you intended to be Switzerland?
Gosh.
Neutrality. So
yes, I did say that, and hopefully colleagues will see that in the spirit of the intention of being new to the organisation, trying to build that trust whilst listening very carefully to colleagues. So I was trying my best to maintain that, and it was quite an isolated position. But in the same time, whether it was Theresa and Christine or whether it was the infection control team, they needed to see someone that was keen to support them, but also had the ability to work at a strategic level if that was required. Because this was about safety and this was about concerns, and I needed to make sure that I could do both things, and I certainly did that to the absolute best of my ability. And you're quite right, it wasn't an easy thing to keep.
No, I'm jumping ahead in your statement a little bit, but elsewhere you say that you were trying to look at things from an independent perspective, but you immediately recognise that, as you put it, that may not have longevity.
Absolutely.
So that any intention to stay in Switzerland might have disappeared fairly soon. Is that really what you're pointing out?
Well, I think it was a risk, and I really think that would depend on whether I could gain people's trust, whether the assessments that I was making and the direction of travel in terms of moving colleagues and the service forward. I think being able to have trust, but people seeing that I was listening and that what the concerns that they were telling me or the wishes that they wished to have in terms of moving the service forward, I was doing that too. And I think people needed to see change if that was what mattered to them. So I think I was trying to do those three things. I was trying to be as independent as possible. I was trying to listen to everyone and be equally challenging to everyone. I was trying to take what people were telling me to create a way of moving forward. And I was also, there's a personal and a leadership perspective where, the people were people trusting me and trusting the way that I was trying to take things forward.
Can I just ask you a point of information at the moment? At various points in your evidence, you refer to the board's positioning paper. Did you participate in the drafting of that paper?
No.
If we can move on in your witness statement now to page 434, and I'm going now to paragraph 9, and I think you report, I think this is it's perhaps where the challenge of your position starts to emerge in the wording, because a minute or two ago you said you needed access to the chief executive, and one immediately understands that. Here you say, I was reporting to the chief executive, which is perhaps a reflection of a management link there. You see the point I'm making?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the arrangement that my Scottish Government colleagues made. I think, as I'd said previously, that they had some additional support coming into Greater Glasgow and Clyde. There was Professor Bain, and then I was asked to come in, and there was also a suggestion that some other colleagues may come in to add capacity. Professor Bain demitted her role after a few months, and no other colleagues came in. So I'm in this central place, and you will see from later on in my statement that some of the work that I initially did was commissioned by the Chief Executive in terms of the organisational development or bringing people together. So the arrangement to report to Jane Grant was made by the Scottish Government, and Mrs Grant obviously accepted that. But going back to that position, that I was trying to achieve, I was absolutely clear, and in the brief that the Chief Executive had given me was that I needed to make sure that I was supporting people, that patient safety was front and centre, and that obviously as a Chief Executive she would want to know if I was finding things that were concerning. And I did that, as I've said in my statement, through kind of informal arrangements, and I also kept in touch with the Chief Nursing Officer.
The point about being promised extra bodies and them not arriving, I think for the record appears in your answer to question 8 on the same page, but we need to go back to that.
Sorry.
And then the question is, well, what were you told about what had been going on? And what you say in answer to that, the foot of that page, is that the Chief Nursing Officer said that there were some microbiology colleagues within NHS GGC who had and continued to raise concerns regarding infections which they believed were connected to the building and the environment. Just pausing at that point, is there anything inappropriate if a professional thinks there's a concern in them making that known?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Mr.
Sorry,
Connell?
yes. What you said in answer 10 was that the Chief Nursing Officer shared that there were some microbiology colleagues within NHS GGC who had and continued to raise concerns regarding infections which they believed were connected to the, we call it just to the building for the moment. And I'm just saying, well, let's stop the sentence there for a moment and say, if a microbiology colleague has a concern, which professionally they believe is connected, is there anything inappropriate with them raising it?
No, not at all. Not at all. And in terms of my understanding, when I was approached by the CNO, it really was in response to having someone in that space that could, be fresh in the space, to be neutral, as my colleagues have said. And so no, and I think that was the reason in terms of the chief nurse speaking to me. So no concern.
The additional point that you then go on to make at the foot of that page and going on to the top of 435 is that you thought you were going to be the liaison with Scottish Government, but you discovered that these colleagues, and I'm assuming you're talking about Christine Peters and Teresa Inkster there, is that right?
So at that point, she just had said colleagues. My understanding from the conversation and just from recall, that it wasn't just Teresa and Christine. She'd said a small group of colleagues. So that would have been my understanding.
But you make a point, I think, of criticism there that they were in communication direct with colleagues in Scottish Government, and you thought you were going to be the contact, and this was being supported by people in government as opposed to discouraged. Yeah. And that wasn't something you were very pleased with.
I don't know that I would say pleased with, and I was really thoughtful about putting this so early in my statement. But as explained, I've been asked to come into a situation, and it was probably, much more complex than I could have imagined. What I'm showing here, and this was not about my microbiologist colleagues, but one of the things that I was trying to do, and you will see in my statement, there was so much trauma experienced by staff. That's what they were conveying to me in terms of, how they were feeling. And what I was trying to say here is that everyone was trying to support my microbiologist colleagues. And I think it was more than just Teresa and Christine. But I was here trying to help people, support people, and move forward if I possibly could with my colleagues. And at the same time, when people were still having concerns, that was sitting outside the process. So I'm trying to support the infection control team. There was lots of other colleagues, and also within this space, Teresa and Christine were part of the work that I was doing. And there was other conversations. So I was really just trying to, no criticism on my microbiology colleagues, but I was trying to show the context in which I was trying to help support colleagues in Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Oh, I just wanted to ask you about that because I'm conscious that people produce answers to questions, they produce a witness statement, and then sometimes you need to look back at it again.
Sure.
And you said you didn't intend any criticism, but the end of that paragraph says this continual questioning of processes hindered the process and undermined the position I was being asked to fulfill, which sounds perhaps to the outside reader as a criticism.
Yeah, and that was not intended, and I can see why you would think that. I think I was having the responsibility where people are sharing their concerns and how that has made them feel. What I was trying to do was to wrap around the support, and people were taking part in that. And therefore, if whether it was the infection control team or whether it was my colleagues with concerns, if there's other avenues opening when I'm trying to help people move forward, you could see that there may be colleagues having to consistently tell their information here when I'm here thinking that we've captured that and we're trying to move forward. So and I can see the criticism. I genuinely was trying to show the inquiry, the complexity of the environment in which and colleagues were supporting me and in which I was trying to support them.
I wonder if you can help me.
Of course.
Professor. The way this witness statement came to be is that we provided you with a list of questions,
Yeah.
and you provided us with the
Absolutely.
answers.
Yeah.
And therefore the words are your words.
Yes, they absolutely are.
Now, going back to what the Chief Nursing Officer told you at the beginning, I'm looking at page 434. Fiona McQueen shared that there were some microbiology colleagues within NHS GGC who had and continued to raise concerns. Now,
Yeah.
what's the significance of the word continued?
I think the Chief Nursing Officer was alerting me in that statement to the fact that that it, you know, there required to be more work done. I think Your Lordship, she was simply in that trying to understand that there were concerns and that they were continuing to raise concerns. And in answering Mr. I think then what I was understanding is that everyone was still trying to support my colleagues who were raising concerns. They'd set up a new process in which I would come in to support. And what I was seeing here was that in trying to move things forward, there was still lots of other conversations happening around that. And I was just recognising that that could pose a risk to both the trust that people had in me in this space and also my ability to take actions that may support colleagues in terms of moving forward. So I think it was a context piece, Your Lordship.
Going over to the next page, you say, despite reaching out to those with concerns, now I take it that these would include Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster. Out with, I think, probably should be one word. Is that right?
I think so.
Process continued. So what's this a reference to?
So everyone's concerns I had gathered through listening and gathering information as part of the organisational development process. So my colleagues, Teresa and Christine, were sharing what was concerning them, and I was also listening to a range of other stakeholders, and including the infection prevention and control team. So the concerns of how infection control felt to people in Greater Glasgow and Clyde are the processes that I'm sharing here. And the other process is that I'm trying to help move colleagues forward based on their experience. And those two things were constantly, it was quite a dynamic situation. So the continual question of processes is people's concerns, which wasn't just Teresa and Christine. The infection control team were raising concerns of process. And then I am trying to, having heard all of that, thinking about what we might need to do to create the system to work as best as we can and build the relationships. So they're the two processes that I refer to there, Your Lordship.
This pattern of behaviours was supported by colleagues in SG. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, patterns of behaviours has a sort of critical flavour to it.
Yeah.
So, what was wrong with the behaviours, if I'm right in interpreting that as critical?
Yeah. And again, I can see why that would feel critical. And I was simply observing that across the system that I was working with, my microbiology colleagues, some of my senior manager colleagues and the infection control team, people were quite rooted in their beliefs and views and they're absolutely their truth, and I understood that. But the patterns of challenging processes, which was across the system. This is not just, I'm not just speaking about my two colleagues in particular, Teresa and Christine here. What I was seeing is just patterns of behaviours that had been happening over what I think would have been the kind of recent history. So they were kind of probably just speaking in more organisational development terms. It's just what I'm witnessing, and when I'm listening to people and what I'm seeing, it's just a constant way of behaving, if you will.
Was supported by colleagues in Scottish government. Again, is that a criticism?
So I think it refers to my earlier point where Scottish Government colleagues had asked me to come in, and I'm working with everyone equally in my as neutral and as position as I can. And I think if I'm being fair to my Scottish Government colleagues, if colleagues have got concerns, they're still going to my Scottish Government colleagues. And I did have conversations to say, I understand that, but at least if I can have that information, it then allows me to make sure that I can continue. Otherwise, as I've said, it you know, and whether people intended it or not, it did undermine the position I was trying to fulfill. And as I said, Your Lordship, that you know, having the neutrality to look at the system as fresh as I could, because I'd never been in the system. Well, I trained in the Victoria when I was very young, but I hadn't been in the system for a very long time. I was trying to make sure that Teresa and Christine and other colleagues with concerns could feel supported. And I was also trying to create a way where the infection and prevention control team really felt that their position was pretty impossible. Apologies if I'm not being clear, and it's a very human dynamic that I was managing. I think my Scottish Government colleagues, if colleagues were wanting to raise concerns, of course they must be able to do that, but the risk of that is the process that Scottish Government colleagues have set up could be undermined, and that was simply trying to show the inquiry, the range of complexity that was in the system.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Conlon.
I'll see if I can take a general question now, because it cropped up at various places. At various points in your questionnaire come witness statement, you were asked about things that happened prior to 2020 when you became involved. And you say, well, I really wasn't there, so it's not for me to comment. In terms of the challenges that you faced in this new role, I wonder what you think of this proposition. We've heard quite a lot of evidence about the challenges, the issues, just to use neutral phrases, that arose in the hospital probably from 2015 right through until not long before you arrive. And some of the colleagues you were dealing with had lived through all of that.
Absolutely.
And did that not make it more challenging for you to come in and try to impose your position on anyone?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think lots of times I really considered should I know all the history? Would that help? Or should I come in and not have the information so that I could be in the moment and try and support colleagues moving forward? I think that, and I mention it in my statement, that listening to colleagues and their concerns and their ways of working over a long period of time was really hard to hear. And that was from a range of colleagues. So I think in some ways, not having history and not having the deep knowledge, I think allowed me to really hear and listen and try and understand, and also try at a human level of understand what might take, what I might do with the support of colleagues that are skilled in organisational development to create a way that we might be able to help colleagues move forward. So I think it was really difficult. I found it just as colleagues, and I've said here today, as colleagues having to constantly relive their truth, I think it was really hard for me to do that. And then the responsibility that I have to make sure that in hearing that I took care of people as well as take care of the information and try and find a way that perhaps would support colleagues in the future. And that's absolutely what I did to the best of my ability, despite the complexities. And I didn't know any colleagues. And I've said it elsewhere that colleagues were open, they shared with me, they were looking to find a way forward, and I felt the responsibility of that.
I think one way that's sometimes used to express this kind of challenge, and I want to see whether you agree with it or not, is that you can't look to the future until you understand the past.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Just moving on, the point that we picked up earlier about you realising your independence might not have longevity appears for the notes in paragraph 13 on page 437. One of the issues that's been raised by others is that initially you were regarded, it would appear, as a new neutral person.
Yeah.
And then one of the criticisms is then we discovered that Professor Wallace uses management speak to answer questions. Have you heard that criticism before?
No, I haven't heard that particular, but I think working with my organisational development colleagues, we were using some terms, if you will, to try and find that way forward. So, and I guess that, you know, as I've said to you, I'm a senior leader. We do have a particular way of speaking. I do try and speak plainly, but also I think in relation to one of my earlier points, I think the benefit of me being in this neutral position when I was a really senior colleague in another health board and coming into Greater Glasgow and Clyde, I was able to use the experience that I have in this space. So colleagues need to forgive me for speaking in management speak, but what I was really trying to do was to use the skills and experience I have with the organisational development colleagues to create a different way forward. So I'll need to take that criticism, but I'd hope that colleagues would see that they had a very senior colleague working alongside them, and I think that's the bit that I was bringing to working across Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
I just wanted to see if I could find an example.
Yep.
One of the things you deal with in your evidence is an action plan for the paediatric intensive care unit, and I don't think we need to read through the evidence about that.
Sure.
But if we go to page 440, you've explained what's in the action plan, you explained the various items, you say it was fully implemented. You asked, was it completed? Yes. And then you asked a question halfway down page 440, how effective have the plans been? Which on one view is a relatively short and simple question, to which your answer is, PICU is and continues to be a challenging environment due to the vulnerability and complexity of the patient cohort. Therefore, PICU continues to be a focus and robustly managed, supported and monitored. Now, that might be regarded by some as answering a simple question with a series of management speak without actually dealing with the question. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes.
Because the answer might have been very effective, not at all effective, we don't know yet, but
yeah,
you answered it by telling us a lot of other things.
Yeah, and I accept that. I was probably trying to be helpful, and also in relation to the PQ action plan, that was something that I had taken over from Professor Bain, and so I was coming into the work halfway through. And I guess for me, the reason I've maybe added the extra words is because that the paediatric intensive care unit does continue to be a focus. So, and that's simply what I meant by that. But I accept your version of points.
Let me ask you some more really information points, because this may be helpful to the inquiry more generally. Obviously, there were a series of investigations. Somebody said it's the most investigated hospital. There was the independent review, there was the oversight board interim report and final report, there was the case note review. And one of the things that happened in your witness statement was you were asked, well, what happened to the recommendations from these various communications? And am I right in thinking two things? Firstly, that the way a record was kept, or at least laterally, of what was happening about these recommendations was to create a spreadsheet with the recommendation, who was in charge of it, what they were supposed to do, and what was then done. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think I'm right in saying that there's a 2024 version of that spreadsheet, which you have, but for various technical reasons, due to a SharePoint problem, we've been advised we don't have yet, but is coming our way. But that should have all of that information on it, I take it.
Yes, absolutely. If I may, so that process of the spreadsheet was an organisational control system, and to make sure that the actions were completed, but also that they were being tested to make sure that they had been implemented or that they were working. How the actions from all of these reports were ensured that they were being delivered. We all had individual areas, and you'll see that from the report, but also there was a gold command structure set up, and those structures were being talked about because during the pandemic, the gold and silver, bronze commands were in the fore, and that was set up, and the work of all of these requirements or actions were challenged and tested in the organisation to make sure they were being delivered. And then the spreadsheet and the SharePoint that you refer will show the documentary evidence of that. So there was a process in the organisation to make sure that the actions were being taken forward, that they were being taken forward timely, and there was an additional process to make sure that if an action was put in place, that it indeed had been implemented. So there was two things there, if that's helpful.
Did I hear you use the expression gold and silver?
Yes, gold, silver and bronze.
Right. It's quite important that those of us who don't necessarily have access to more technical language understand what you're saying. Now, am I right in thinking that the expression gold in this context means strategic level?
Yes.
Silver means tactical level?
Absolutely.
And if we get to bronze, which I don't think we do in your statement,
No.
that would mean operational.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And it became to the fore, Your Lordship, during the pandemic. So that was used in Greater Glasgow and Clyde to show the focus on these actions.
Thank you.
And in effect, what happened in your witness statement, but you were asked, have all these recommendations been done? And you said, yes, they have. I think as of August of 24. And then you're asked, is there anywhere we can see that documented? And I think my understanding is that the best place to find that documented is in the 2024 version of the document we've just discussed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's the most up-to-date one. Absolutely.
And we're told that that's coming. There's said to be some difficulty in accessing SharePoint. But in any event, this again, this is quite important from a technical perspective. In your witness statement at page 444, we'll just bring that up. You confirm that all the recommendations of the Oversight Board have now been completed as of August 24. That's your position.
Yeah, well, certainly that's the document that I reviewed in relation to all of my actions.
And then you're asked a similar question about the case note review, and on 445 you say, as far as you're concerned, they've all been implemented.
As far as the information that that I have, and obviously I would be looking at the actions that were assigned to myself as a lead. But yeah, that's my understanding.
I wonder if we can just look at a couple of these, because they're said to be of particular interest. Can we look at the ARGG that's referred to on page 445, bundle 27, volume 14, page 25. We'll just bring that up. And I'm looking for para 31. I think it should be something like page 39. Can we just scroll through this? I'm looking for what's described as para 31. It's a reference to NHGC reviewing the ICNet alert organism list.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'll not be able to find it now. Oh yes, it's down at the foot of the page that we're looking at the moment in 7.1. Was that one of the ones that was for you to deal with?
Yeah, well, it says in, yep, it would be, yeah.
So int director of IC is...
I think so. I think so. It doesn't have my initials, which normally does, but I think they would have been for me. That would be the interim director of infection control. Yeah.
I think the initials against it are probably Sandra Devine's, it would appear.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, I think either way we had worked on these together, because again, I was fairly new in post, and also, as I've said in my statement, supporting the infection control team. So I would have been close to all of these, and again, going back to the role in which you described earlier, in terms of that, you know, I was supporting and also making sure that my colleagues had the support to do their roles. So you would have saw me supporting both having the lead for something and then working closely with the colleagues and the board.
So your understanding is that is an action that is complete?
Yeah. Yeah, my understanding is that that's complete, yeah.
And the next one, no, back to it. I need to move down, I think, another one. Looking for one that says revisiting concerns about outbreaks of gram-negative environmental infections, which for some reason doesn't appear here. Can we just scroll on? I apologize, I've been given a slightly different document. Do you remember having to look at a recommendation that you had to review trigger concerns about future outbreaks and reliance on SPC charts should be reevaluated? And that does seem to be one that you were dealing with. Do you remember dealing with that?
Yeah, yeah, I would. I mean, yeah.
And is your recollection that the recommendation was complied with?
Yeah, that is my Yeah, that is my recollection.
Thank you. And just again, for completeness, we can leave that document now. You were also asked about the independent review and what came out of the independent review, and your evidence in page 447 of your witness statement. We just go there. 2/3 of the way down is that, so far as you're aware, there are no outstanding actions arising from that independent review.
That is my understanding, and yeah, in terms of, I was pretty new in the board at that time, and I did have specific in relation specific actions which I then took into Silver Command, but I was in a supportive role in there. But that I'm not sure about the whole document, but my understanding is the actions that I had were complete and yeah, for these, yeah.
I've been asked to raise another question with you about the incident management process framework, and you deal with this on page 451 of your witness statement. And you use an interesting word there, which we've seen used elsewhere. You say you've got an incident management process framework, etc., and you say this framework is informed by the following documents. And then you mention a number of documents, and you go on to deal with essentially the reporting tool that arises from that. Now, the question that I've been asked to raise with you is it the case that GGC has its own structures about HIAT assessments, which is not precisely the same as the NIPCM Chapter 3 details? Because NSS, I think, are suggesting that you should be doing the same as everybody else here.
Yeah.
I just wondered if I could have your comment on that.
As far as I'm aware that we follow the correct process, the word informed, I don't know whether that suggests that we do not comply. I think I think everyone has worked really hard to make sure that that we're fully compliant, and I think any board would do, and certainly in the board that I was also in at that time, we would do that. So I'm not aware that we're not following that to the absolute letter. And the word inform, I don't know whether that's the issue, but I'm not aware of a variance from that.
I'm advised, and the information I've been given, that the board has developed its own governance structures around carrying out HIAT assessment and criteria for reporting infected relating incidents. And that came from the evidence of someone called Laura Imrie to this inquiry, including its own criteria for deciding when a HIAT will be carried out, if a PAG or IMT is set up, and when incidents are required to report it, also coming from the same source. And I've been asked by NSS to say, well, why are you doing your own thing here?
I'm not aware that there's a variance, and I think the other guidance documents that have been developed to really support staff being following the guidance routinely and easily for them to follow the guidance. I'm not aware that that we are not following the guidance. I'm not.
The reason, obviously, I've been
Yeah.
asked to ask this is that
Understood.
NSS would say, well, if we are trying to keep tabs on what's going on across Scotland, we need all the boards to follow the same system for reporting. Otherwise, we can't make a comparison. Is that a fair point for them to make?
Well, it would absolutely be correct if there's national guidance and there is an omission or change in our part. I am not aware that there's anything within the guidance that we are not following, and I'd need to check that for the inquiry. And I would be obviously concerned about that because, again, from the journey you've taken me on through my statement today and continue to work every single day, everyone is absolutely trying to get this right. In some ways, I think Greater Glasgow and Clyde in its journey has probably been trying even more than or trying to do even more to make sure that they and that we, now that I'm working there, but they, when we're talking about here, were absolutely following things to the letter, and so I'd need to check that, but I'm not aware that we're following anything that I have seen, whether it's our communication strategy to support infection prevention control, whether it's the framework that you mentioned. Absolutely, it reads across to the guidance, and I would be happy to check that for the inquiry.
Well, I think probably all I need to do, given that evidence, is ask you this. Do you accept that it's unhelpful to the national oversight of infection-related issues if different boards use different criteria?
Absolutely. I would add, if I may, that as part of the work that I described earlier on, I did look at other boards, and it was an action for me from the oversight and looking at other boards. And as I think I've said, Greater Glasgow and Clyde compared extremely well, and often were exceeding what was being asked. And again, I was constantly testing what I was seeing, because I was a nurse director in a board at the same time with an infection control lead. And I was also comparing the two systems to my own system, although it was much a smaller system. So, but we must, I mean, the reason for these is to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I absolutely understood that we were.
If we can move on to the next page, please. I have another question for you. In the middle of answer 48, you say that performance against national infection targets was strong and improving across NHS, GGC, and sitting well against other boards. Now, so I give you some context to the question. You'll understand that much of the material the inquiry has been hearing is not about the routinely monitored infections, but about issues of possible connection between infections and the environment, whether it's air or water, doesn't matter. And the question that I need to put to you is, how helpful are these national targets as giving any indication of the risks from the built environment?
I mean, I think I would have to agree that I'd probably answer maybe this in two parts, but the targets in terms of the infections that we're looking at across Scotland is important in the fact that we are comparing systems across NHS Scotland. So I think it is an important benchmark in terms of Greater Glasgow and Clyde as compared to other boards, as it would have been for the board that I was in. I think these infections, although you're right, they're not connected particularly to the concerns perhaps around the built environment, but it shows a whole system that's caring for patients and trying to keep patients safe, and a high degree of compliance with infection control processes across not just the Queen Elizabeth and the Children's Hospital, but all of the hospitals. So it gives an oversight for us for improvement in terms of Greater Glasgow and Clyde. It compares us against other boards and looks to see if we are at all out of kilter. One of the things you'll have seen me reporting in the HEART, and one of the things that coming to Greater Glasgow and Clyde was how do we make sure, and as your Lordship had mentioned earlier, in that bronze command, or that at the very, very fundamental level, is how we supported people every single day to take care of patients in terms of infection prevention and control. And we developed a whole system improvement collaborative. So what this does allow us to see is that a system that's behaving extremely well around infection prevention and control. But you're right, it doesn't deal with, particularly with the areas in relation to the environment. However, within the HEART report, and that was something that coming to Greater Glasgow and Clyde as part of that new approach and listening to colleagues, we did refresh the HEART. And then you'll see in the HEART making sure that we are reporting incidents and outbreaks and narrative in terms of what we were seeing and how we were managing them. So I agree with you that in relation, but it also does show a system that's continuing to improve around the fundamentals of infection control, albeit not particularly linked to the environment, as you've said.
I'm going to pick up with you at various points in your witness statement, issues where you appear to be, I'll perhaps avoid the word criticising, given our conversation earlier, but making comment on what a number of the microbiologists have or have not done. Let me just pick one up here. I can probably do fairly quickly. 453, page 453. What happens here, as I understand it, is that page number 51, Dr. Peters contacts you and says, look, let's talk here of 2 patients, but in fact, 3 have died and 1's very unwell. Now, if I just pause there, because you give a very long narrative explaining how, who did what and when and so on. The facts raised by Dr. Peters are correct, are they not?
Yes, that was in relation to the outbreak in intensive care, which was just a few weeks after me coming to the board, and absolutely what I tried to do was also show the information in relation to how we were caring for people. I think that was a timing. I was pretty disappointed and devastated when I saw that, because everything I was trying to do through the HEART and through colleagues was to make sure that we were as open as we can be. And actually, I was trying to do even more than that, given the context. And this was because the outbreak ran over the reporting period. And what I do now at the board is that I'll have the data that's in the HEART, and I'll have probably almost nearly a month and a half or almost 2 months of data, although the second month wouldn't be verified yet. So what I always try and do is then say, add if there's anything changing in that period, and that was something that I learned from the concerns that Christine had raised, and it was a genuine just timing of reporting. But I can see the concern that it created, and what I wanted to do here in my statement was show the processes in which people were following to understand the outbreak, make sure that we could contain the outbreak and care for people. And it genuinely, when I saw that, was disappointed that in some way the information hadn't been complete. It was not my intention at all.
The reason I put that to you is that there are comments about your microbiology colleagues scattered throughout your statement, and I'm keen to understand exactly what it is that you're saying that they are doing that is, inappropriate. Because I think you told me earlier on that if they have a concern, they're probably obliged to raise it. Mm-hmm. And if we take that one as an example, yes, there was you explained very carefully how that was a reporting date overlap.
Yeah.
But she was right to point out that one thing had said 2, and in fact there were 4.
Yeah.
So she wasn't, making it up or alleging something that was untrue or anything of that kind. Is that not a fair point?
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, in relation to all colleagues, I absolutely did my utmost to listen and hear and to try and make changes. I absolutely did. I think when you look at my statement, and there's about 14 or 16 incidents where my colleagues have written to me. And again, coming to Greater Glasgow and Clyde, I wanted to hear that. And therefore, you're seeing me responding, saying that I'm hearing them, that I'm listening, and that I'm taking, and I usually work with, because it tended to be Teresa and Christine now, to see what they would be comfortable with me linking with the infection control team or others, so that because I was trying to bring people together. And in that space, in the middle, or that neutral space, I was also trying to be fair to Teresa and Christine and also the infection control team. So in my statement, I was just conscious when there were so many of the incidents, I think there's about 14 incidents where colleagues had raised with me, and then you're asking how I've responded to that. What we're seeing is me then responding or trying to give the information to show that we were listening, and that the concerns that Teresa or Christine had in this case were being dealt with as part of a normal process. What you're not seeing is the constant challenge and the responses from the infection control team, because I was trying to be fair to both. And although because these incidents, it looks as if I'm constantly mentioning Teresa and Christine, I think if the infection control team were here, they would feel that I was equally challenging to them, trying to understand. And also, I'm a different individual, new in the organisation, and I had a way that I wanted to help colleagues move forward for the benefit of patients and all those with concerns, including colleagues. So again, as I've said earlier, I accept that these are my words, and I absolutely accept that. And every single thing that Teresa and Christine raised with me, I paid attention to. I tried to make sure that they had the information that they had, and also I had to support the infection control team who were doing a really difficult job every day. And that's why the organisational development work or the team building work I was trying to understand everyone's perspective and then find the common ground that we could move forward. Because in some ways, and I know earlier in the statement, colleagues talked about a fractured system that I was coming to work with. And what I saw was, and I mentioned it, that everyone was trying to look after patients and take care of patients and make sure that people felt safe to come into the hospital. I think that everybody's compass was pointing in that one direction, but in some ways that compass seemed to have been disconnected. And in some ways what I was trying to do, and I was only one individual, but was trying to, with the support of the organisation, to help colleagues make that connection again. I mean, you mentioned colleagues talking about me saying I was neutral or Switzerland or whatever. I also said all of the time I needed everyone in Greater Glasgow and Clyde to help me support them in terms of the way forward. And I think perhaps that feels as if I'm mentioning Teresa and Christine more, but I think if you spoke to the infection control team, I think they would have found me extremely challenging.
Well, I think the point I have to put to you, given you acknowledge that what's in the statement is your words, that you comment on, criticise, whatever phrase one likes to pick. Mm-hmm. Peters, Inkster, that group of microbiologists, if it's not always just the two of them.
Nope.
On quite a few occasions in your statement, mm-hmm. and I didn't find any criticism of anyone else, anywhere else in the statement at all. Which yep. Now I'm open to be corrected about that, but I certainly didn't find it. So I just wonder how you square that with your proposition that you've just given us, that you were being equally challenging to one group as you were to another.
Yeah, and I guess that's maybe an omission in my part in terms of as you said at the beginning, it's been a question and answer, and therefore I have been answering the questions. I think in reflecting, you have an incident here as well, and quite a lot of the questions and answers in my statement are in relation to concerns that my colleagues raised, and therefore you see me responding to them. So you are seeing, you're not seeing a 360-degree vision on that, and I should have perhaps in my statement really broadened that out. But I was I was answering in particular with these questions where colleagues have got concerns about patient safety and about patient care and about infection control processes. I should have perhaps, made it much broader in terms of the challenge that that I was making, and as well as supporting Teresa and Christine, and I used to meet with them every couple of weeks to listen to them and to try and make the connections. I think the infection control team would have felt supported, but I was asking them to work differently. I was also trying to change the narrative that external people had around Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which I thought Greater Glasgow and Clyde could tell a different story or a different kind of narrative. And I haven't included that here, but I think colleagues would have found, and I had lots of incidences where my challenge and my way of working was very difficult for the infection prevention and control team. But as you said at the beginning, I am now in a role where there's not Professor Bain, I'm Director of Infection Prevention Control. I'm having to lead that system, and therefore responding to anybody with concerns is in the context where I am trying to support and manage the system. So I can see why that would feel imbalanced, and I absolutely, I absolutely tried everything I could to treat everybody the same. And as I say, everybody did want a different way forward, and I took that opportunity.
Well, let me just move on. There was another example. For technical reasons I won't go into. I'm not going to put the document on screen, where I think there was a complaint that a particular piece of microbiology hadn't been mentioned in a minute, and you say, well,
Oh yeah.
Yes, it wasn't mentioned, but we don't always mention everything. So there was obviously a difference of view over that. And I said that's dealt with, just for the records, at page 455. So I'll move past that one. Let me ask you about another piece of question answering. 457, you were making the point, no doubt very fairly, in answer to question 60, that more stuff was put in place in GGC than there was anywhere else in these particular areas. And then you asked in question 61, well, did these measures achieve what it was hoped they achieve? To which your answer is, the aim of the measures is always reduction, which might be suggested to you doesn't answer the question. I can see why it's a nice answer to give, but I'm not sure it answers whether these have achieved what they were meant to achieve.
In relation to 58, 59 and 60, I guess the learnings in terms of these very particular cases in these high risk areas in terms of children, I think that RHI had, when I was saying the reporting was robust and there was learning for all Scotland, so the work that RHI had done in looking at the infections around a particular area, then Greater Glasgow and Clyde extended them to other areas. And I think the report was about challenging the rest of Scotland. So I think in terms of these infection outbreaks, in terms of the action plan was, as I say, created by RHI, and again the action plan that again is in the evidence. You'll see that Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and I was just in the organisation at that point, was completing them. I guess in terms of the aim for measures is always reduction, and maybe I should have been more specific in that, but I understand that not all infections can be prevented, but I get up every single day to try and see if we can. And certainly within some of these contexts, and as I explained earlier about what we were trying to do in improvement across the system, we're always going to aim for zero. Even if the patient cohort or the treatments that they're on make them much more susceptible to infection. And again, I should have maybe have elaborated, but for me, and you know, I remember coming to Greater Glasgow and Clyde and being absolutely clear about we're aiming for no harm and zero, despite in some areas we may never be able to do that. And I should have perhaps elaborated on that, but for me, all of these every time is about being better. And even if we get into a best in class, I would still be looking for us to set the bar higher. So that's what I meant by that.
So if we had a little bit of a discussion, I think it was yesterday, with Professor White, because somebody had wanted to say, well, these were an acceptable level of infections. But you, from what you've just said, wouldn't regard saying there's an acceptable level of infections as an appropriate thing to say.
Well, I can't comment on that, but certainly for me and what gets me up every single day is caring for people and supporting staff. And unless we aim for something really quite huge or almost seems out of reach, if we don't do that, then we'll get small incremental changes. And therefore, aiming for zero infections or no pressure injuries or no person falling and harming themselves under our care, then I want to aim for something much greater and hope that the system and that the staff can use improvement to think about the possible. So I understand the likely rates of people you know, who will get an infection in hospitals. I understand that, but it will not stop me from designing a system that's aiming for something much greater, despite knowing the likely evidence in relation to that. So that's certainly where I would come from and what gets me up every single day.
Thank you. Can I move to another page and another topic, 464? One of the issues that's obviously cropped up is that from time to time there are differences of opinion, and let's not get into what these were for the moment. And no doubt there is a process whereby if somebody is not happy, they can complain. The question you then asked in 74 is, what about, you know, where there's a significant difference of opinion, perhaps getting an external element into the system, either, I think it's suggested, either by a peer review, so somebody in specific, or possibly a conversation led by someone else. And you didn't think that was a good idea?
I maybe touches on the answer earlier. So one of the suggestions when in dealing with so many differences of opinion, as we've touched upon, I did think about setting up a kind of space in which we could, where there was a difference in opinion, and we could, you know, we could have that discussion, because that's how I would expect colleagues to have, and conflict, and perhaps with a small c, but conflict is really important in getting improvement. However, when I did suggest that perhaps we would, you know, have a separate process, I couldn't garner support for that. I think in the process that I was with the two organisational development colleagues in terms of trying to find common themes and trying to find answers to them to make the system and colleagues within it feel better, this just felt like the time wasn't right. I think I had support from some colleagues and other colleagues felt that they wouldn't be safe in that space in terms of the relationships weren't strong enough yet. And also I was being challenged about doing things out with the system. And what I'm trying to do in terms of supporting colleagues is to make sure that they can be supported and that the system works. And what, similar to the conversation that you'd had earlier with me around the CNO, if we've got a system and we're trying to make it work and we're trying to build confidence, if you create things outside the system, you know, we could be in a risk of missing things or not following the process and not making sure things are sitting within the organisation's governance and risk management. So I think the timing, I did suggest it. I did think it would be a helpful thing. I think it was a suggestion from, I think it was conversations I'd had with Teresa, who was really supportive of me and showing some of the ways that they worked before. And it was out of that conversation with Teresa that we thought of maybe having this space. And the timing, my assessment was that would not, it just wouldn't work. And I did revisit it, and I had a really, again, in terms of maybe perhaps me not showing the 360-degree, I had a really difficult conversation with colleagues in relation to could we make this work, and it wasn't felt that was safe to do so, and that I risked sitting outside of the system in terms of that additionality. Would sit outside the management arrangements. It just could be quite destabilising, and for those reasons I didn't pursue it, although I did consider it.
Lord, this might be an appropriate time to break.
Yes, as I said, we usually take our lunch break between 1 and 2. So if I could ask you to be back for 2 o'clock. Thank
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.